Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I know this time of year is really busy, so it's great to see so many people out. My name is Adam Gaudry. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies. I've been working with Sheila McLean and Alex Wilson over in the College of Education to put this on. This is something that has been many months in the making, and so we're really excited to see a big turnout, to have a recording that will be online later if you want to consult that. And we're just generally excited to be here. I'd also like to take a moment before we get started to thank our many sponsors. To do an event of this magnitude, especially in conjunction with the one we're doing tonight, it takes a lot of people and a lot of generosity in order to kind of put this together. So I'd like to thank the John Ranton McIntosh Visiting Scholar Fund, the Department of Indigenous Studies, the Aboriginal Education Research Center, the Arts and Science Role Model Speakers Fund, the Department of Educational Foundations, the Humanities Research Unit, the Department of History, the Women and Gender Studies Program, the Interdisciplinary Center for Culture and Creativity, and the Social Justice, Anti-Racist, Anti-Oppressive Forum on Education. So a great list of scholars, a great group of people that have contributed resources to allow us to put this together. I also want to thank everybody, and there's many of you who helped us put this on in other ways, dedicated your time, your money, your energy, your insight, and to allow us to do this. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to also invite you to our sister event tonight, the Indigenous Feminisms Power Panel, which they're all in the room here, so we're happy to have them here. Audra Simpson, Kim Tallbear, and Kim Anderson will be speaking. And that's tonight at Station 20 West, starting at 7:30. So I'd like to invite you all to attend that as well. Sorry, 7. Starts at 7. If you're unable to make it, it will also be recorded and available to you after. So today's talk, Reconciliation and its Discontents, Settler Governance in an Age of Sorrow, I think problematizes a term which has become very ubiquitous in Canadian politics. It is something that is generally seen as good. Its contribution to helping us move forward is somewhat unquestioned. And so I think it's a really important time to also to take a look at the deeper meaning behind this word, behind these ideas. And we're very fortunate to have a very gifted scholar and a very gifted theorist here to help us do that. So to answer this kind of question, we now turn to Dr. Audra Simpson. Audra Simpson is an associate professor in anthropology at Columbia University. She is the author of the award-winning book, Mohawk Interruptus, Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States from Duke University Press, and a co-editor of Theorizing Native Studies, also from Duke University Press. Both are available from Turning the Tide, the table out front. She has articles in Cultural Anthropology, American Quarterly, Junctures, Law and Contemporary Problems, and the Wichazo Sa Review. In 2010, she won Columbia University's School of General Studies Excellent in Teaching Award, and she is a Ganawage Mohawk. Could you all please join me in welcoming Professor Audra Simpson?
Thanks so much. I'm really thrilled to be here. This is my third time in Saskatoon. The last time I was here was for NYSA, and I had the great thrill of meeting the I Don't Know More women and talking to lots of folks out here, so I'm just thrilled to be back. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Treaty 6 people for holding on to their territory, for holding ground, also for creating a space of critical engagement here, as well as being defenders of their land. And I'd like to thank you all for inviting me. Sheila McLean has been an amazing organizer, along with Alex Wilson, Adam Gaudry. All of you have made me feel so welcome and have done an expert job in organizing this visit, and I thank you so much. This is a runaway chapter from my first book, which has become I'd say, the conceptual core of my second book, which is called Savage States, Settler Governance in an Age of Sorrow. I consider this an emotional history of the present. The first section is called Sovereignties Collide, or Settler Fantasy. I can't decide on which I like better. I might leave it as it is. This paper tells a story of settlement. By settlement, I mean the project of territorial possession and demographic and bodily displacement of Indigenous peoples in what is now understood to be the United States and Canada. This is something that is imagined to be in the past tense, as in settled. The object itself becomes a verb, the settling of land, the settling of consciousness. One might then add to this the making of moral and political worlds atop the worlds of others. This making of a new world is a story, it's a story that nation states like to tell about themselves, like to tell others about what is North America. Now, this is a very likable story, I would say, and the likable story is that all matters have been settled. So settled, in fact, that this is a multicultural, liberal, and immigrant society. People came here, by the way. That's why it's settled. The conditions by which they came are irrelevant. The people that were here before are irrelevant. And this irrelevance is owing to many things. But in part, I'd say to the attention given to the spectacular. Among the spectacular, I'm going to focus in very briefly here in my introduction, is skin, and I would say youth. So were we to take the vantage point of, say, the United States, suggested by the visuality, the shocking visuality for some, of an African American president, we might conclude that, in fact, not only have matters been settled, but the US is a pretty tolerant place, exclamation point. It is a place that embraces the difference of others enough to allow one to be led by the formerly subjected and actually formerly enslaved. Witness Obama. And bracket Obama's specificity. Bracket his wonderfully complex biography. Bracket the deceased bodies of unarmed black men in the streets. Bracket as well the 63.9% native incarceration rate at Saskatchewan's penitentiary, a male minimum, medium, and maximum penitentiary. Bracket the killings, bracket the cagings, bracket the counterfactuals. But one might say that if we focus on Obama's skin, if we pay attention, and if we enjoy the new youthful exuberance of recent Prime Minister-elect Justin Trudeau's youthful gait, his presumably, what I hear from all my friends on Facebook, the voters, his presumably handsome face, if we enjoy the image of him, if we partake in that image of him in a headdress, we might infer and feel, in fact, pleasure and think things are okay in regards to the past visiting itself upon the present. These images, these optics suggest things may be settled, or things might be almost settled, or either way we might have things to be hopeful for, right? Things are okay as in things are settled or about to be settled. Again, the object is the verb. History is redressed, reconciled. Yet were we even to take these thin signs, these signifiers, these images as signs of history and historical redress, which I think is what the fixation is with his blackness and with Trudeau's supposedly handsome but definitely white face. That's what it's supposed to do for us, to tell us. Then we would be forced, if we were to dig deeper, we would be forced to ask after the reasons for this significance, the reasons for this great pleasure in the image, to scratch at the surface that is concealed by these fetishized images of hope. And in doing so, find the figure of the non-citizen, the formerly enslaved, the dispossessed, and the struggle of and for history. Thus, the very conditions of the electoral system surface as matters to be contemplated along with the territory that it presumes to govern. And this surfacing pushes to larger questions of governance and justice. And with that round of questions initiated by the scratch on the image, you might find the thing that can't be spoken of, or spoken of in clear, unambiguous, and direct language: Indigenous dispossession. And once you consider this dispossession as indeed something that can be finally thought, that can be spoken of, and in fact a thing that is foundational context, not only for this sense of questioning, but also one's life, one's property, one's flourishing, then you might want to ask, what histories can make a break for an opening in political consciousness, and which histories do not? So, I'm going to tell a story of interrelated histories, saturated with a kind of eventfulness, but I will argue are of a piece with each other, in fact form a kind of structure. But I start this analysis with Obama's skin, with Trudeau's skin, and what these phenotypical surfaces are taken to signal to multiple publics. It is the skin's presumed power to signal a break with a grievous past that makes their skin so powerful. And here I want to say that this is a past that we all presumably depart from, that does not form a departure for Indigenous peoples, because our present collapses the past. It calls up the past as we contort still to make way for everyone else's present and future. The story I'm telling then is of multiple sovereignties and not only races. And this, I think, is something that is not assimilatable or signalable to nation states whose ongoing political lives are predicated upon the elimination not only of Indigenous bodies, but the ongoing elimination of our political orders, our governmental systems, and our title to land. And I think the murdered and missing Indigenous women are a symptom of this project, because women embody all of that. Now, this endurance, this death drive endurance of settler colonialism as wedded to state formation, is what the late comparative historian Patrick Wolfe called settler colonialism, and qualified as a structure and not an event. Yet, Indigenous sovereignty wrestles with the ongoing techniques of elimination, as this sovereignty, and this is of course itself a signifier that sometimes fails to signal what it should, and we can talk about that. This sovereignty remains intact in our consciousness, our lives, in our legal mandates, our legal traditions, our aspirations. So my question then is how governance occurs in such a tight spot, in a geopolitical context where sovereignties necessarily must collide, in spaces of active disavowal of Indigenous peoples, disavowal of Indigenous elimination, and disavowal of a prior, a history other than what is being told. Yet simultaneously in a context in which we are now being told repeatedly, in every instance, right? On every level, popular culture, legal culture, this latest incident with Wabkinu, which I'm dying to write about, but I'm still too pissed. We are being asked or told to reconcile with this difficult past that is both here and not here, and in doing so, to perpetually start anew. Now, this is less so in the United States, of course. The settlement project is clearer in Canada, where some histories are simply impossible to deny. Indigenous peoples, impossible to deny. Of course, they still kill us, right? Take our children. And yet are still selected for, where political and historical consciousness, I would say because of the governmental project to dispossess, necessarily knows scant but very specified forms of the past. I will argue that this question of governance in this context is in fact an ongoing question, and finding justice in the present finds its answer in an affective and simultaneously extractive mode. So here we have land plundered still for what it yields, oil, and Indigenous people plundered or extracted from for what we yield, our experiences rendered as stories of suffering. Stories that, like oil, fuel governance. And this sort of politics, this new sort of politics, still extractive, deeply extractive, the affective and the extractive materialist sort, is executed through the technique of an inherently limited and limiting formation, the form of a contract. Contract theory, contractual thinking, aids in this process as the contract then repairs and presumably cancels out the possibility of all further claims to harm. The cost of justice, however, is pain, and its value is set within a market of sympathy, a market that is inherently limited by the structural and thus distributive model of a market that attempts to commensurate fundamentally different polities, political orders. In this wonderful, crazy context, it's not wonderful, but this crazy context, affect, emotion, the performance, the endless performance of emotion becomes key. And the language of transitional justice and reconciliation move to work this wound, to take up and select the experiences that matter in exercises of absolution, so that indeed, I will demonstrate, a show can go on. So that there will be a better past, an improved past, one that is awful, but is atomized, is acknowledged, and then can be moved on and moved from. Now, key to this, of course, are emotions, and the feeling of sympathy, like savagery, is a mode of emoting that is predicated upon an identification that is based, the early moral philosopher Hume argued, who is somehow really relevant in this moment, really relevant. These OGs, these white OGs are very relevant. Their thinking is useful to explain their craziness in the present. Argues, in a sense, not craziness, but this affective mode of governing, argues in a sense of fundamental sameness of shared bodily form and shared parallel passions. This sense of a shared bodily form and thus passions is presumed but is also read upon other bodies, and the resemblances and non-resemblances are registered accordingly. And in this imagined pain, pain may be read somatically on another as it would be felt for oneself. Now, Humesian ethics, the moral ethics of sympathetic passions, can guide an understanding of contemporary liberal, and in the context of the US and Canada, settler politics today. As I will demonstrate, this is how they operate. State-induced injury has been constructed as a legal and social and political cause for concern, and passions part of the remedy. A little bit of money too, but passions part of the remedy. And I'm using their language of passions. Before moving further into the meat of this, I'll say, though, because I can't resist it, and I sometimes have to take this out of this piece, but I like it too much, I can't let go of it. I have like attachment to it. I'm like a hoarder with this idea. It's like you'll see it like kind of hangs there differently. Before moving into the meat of this, I'll say that, because I can't resist it, that Indigenous subjects have been explicitly for the settler one's better self or one's worse self through time. And that identification can be generative and may itself, however, operate as a field of force. And savagery, which was encoded in the first Indian Acts, savagery, Proto-Indian Acts, more explicitly than sympathy, has been productively tracked by scholars within American and Canadian studies for years. Here I'm thinking of the indigenous savage and Pierce's savagism and civilization and the subsequent savages that proliferate the captivity literature, representing various forms of American anxiety, American longing, American horror, Americans. However, the more specified question I wish to propose and provide critical nourishment for elaborates an old one, and is one that animates Canadian politics today and forms an unspeakable and underlying grid in American democratic politics. And that is, what is the possibility of justice or political transformation? The real possibility for political transformation when one must take the form of a wound. And here I want to be specific. The idiom for meting out justice is not treaty, it's not obligation, it's not international relations, it's not our pre-existing diplomatic relations with these people, not our sovereignty, but actual injury that they caused. And more specifically, and here I mean for the anthropologists here ethnographically, how are those wounds to be known? How do politics then take the form of claims? And how then may justice be met out with money? Just money. What are the political possibilities afforded within such a framework? The framework seems to harmonize and balance a fundamental disjuncture, something that can't be balanced. A sovereign state, in Dale Turner's argument, 2006 argument, that was and is unwilling to rescind its false claims to indigenous land and life and indigenous struggles for that land and life as our sovereignty. So here the earlier question moves through this latticework of possibility or impossibility, and I now wish to move it more explicitly to the time-sensitive model of the contract. What is then the space of politics that is afforded to those whose histories, whose selves, and aspirations are whittled down to the space of a claimant, and a claimant whose prior is suffering? The prior here, I think, is actually the untranslatability of robust life, of sovereignty, no matter how strangulated it may be in practice. A claimant who perhaps does or perhaps then does not deserve reparation or redress. And how does this play out when those whose suffering again is attributable fundamentally to state sovereignty via what they call boarding schools in the states, what we know to be residential schools up here, germ warfare, the Indian Act itself? Settler sovereignty, I've argued elsewhere, in particular in my book, is precarious, and yet it is hegemonic, right? It's total. It tries to be totalizing through its instantiation in law, and is being heard and performed through the recurring question of indigenous rights. And I don't even know why I have reparations in this piece, but attempted reparations repeatedly in the theater of the court. It's in the theater of the courts, in part, that settler sovereignty sets itself up in an adversarial or bequeathing relationship to indigenous sovereignty. And in fact, it is through settler sovereignty that indigenous sovereignty, in a legal sense, gets its form. And here it is in the performance of a contrite state, a state that says, I am sorry. That the movement, presumably from one point of history, is moved into another. When we transition from an injured past to a new present. The former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper's 2008 apology to Indigenous peoples here was to do just this. Yet consider this point from an interview I did on the effect of the apology to Indigenous people. We have to accept their innocence in law. We have to accept that none of them have to come forward and account for their crimes. South Africa did the opposite. In order to get out of being charged, you had to account and do a full accounting to black folks. White people had to account to black folks. What we have here, this is just voyeurism. And now they want to shred the evidence. And they didn't turn over their documents. So innocence is what they're after, and absolution. Not from us, though, from their own people. The voyeurism that she speaks of is the reconciliation package that is cemented by the apology and creates a theater of sorts for Canadians to sit within and watch as their history is resorted for them and repaired for them. She is speaking in non-specific language about the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that follows the formal apology and results from the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, 2007 agreement. In order to consider now what gets us to this point of politics that can be called by someone with such certainty voyeurism, I will chart the parallel sovereignties that are incommensurate as they brush up and against each other. I'm arguing that these are, as I said, market forces of sympathy, a new order of affective politics, new modes of rendering justice or not. So now I move to manifestations of political life. And this becomes a story in parts, if you will. One, a story of Indian or indigenous foment, or rather unambiguous, rather classic armed resistance as an instantiation of our sovereignty. Two, our bodily suffering as a negation of these acts of assertion and sovereignty, and I would say reinstantiation of state sovereignty. And three, this state-driven project of truth and reconciliation as a failed commensuration of both. So, first we had settler fantasy, now we have sovereignty. And you'll recognize some of this from my book. Because I tell the story, I like the way I tell the story there, and I pull it into this piece as well. In the 1990s in Canada, there were several national injuries to be adjudicated, all having to do with native bodies, territorial or otherwise, and their urgent, spectacular, and rupturing pain upon the settler nation's international image. An image, we were told, of one of the most tolerant and beneficent countries in the world. The first rupturing episode or incident occurred in the summer of 1990 and was rendered in the popular English newspapers as, quote, the Indian Summer. This long, hot summer, we were repeatedly told, as we all experienced it, was on another scale an explosive summer, when Mohawks and allied individuals took up AK-47s and held ground at Gunnesadage, a reserve community in Quebec, what is now Quebec, in a 78-day defense of their territory against state-sanctioned land expropriation. This was a land expropriation that was to annex a Mohawk burial ground and sacred pine trees in order to extend a 9-hole golf course by 9 more holes and construct luxury condominiums in place of or on top of the dead and in the horrified face of the living. Now, why did the Mohawks do what they did? They did what they did in part because of their own constitutional framework, the Gairnaragoa, the Great Law of Peace, or Great Binding Law, which decrees that they or we have to defend our land from encroachment, but also because of the vulnerable and contested nature of title to that land. Land that could not be owned in a proper or improper sense, because Indians in Canada can never own land in a full Lockean sense, even when we've been encouraged by the state to farm it in preparation for true title and our own civilization, and entry into a life of agriculture and settler citizenship. Thus, their bodies and the land that contained them was vulnerable beyond the notion of subsurface rights, the so-called Aboriginal right to use. Their bodies had no integrity even as their genealogic property, even in a deceased state. Who was protected in this game of leisure? The gentleman's game of leisure. Golf. Golf would here trump a seigneurial obligation of protection, would trump imperfectly rendered use and occupancy, would trump, it's so ironic to say these words now, would trump 2 centuries of active registrable protest. Operating as the most recent affront to the territorial integrity of this northernmost tip of traditional Mohawk territory, the law, settler law, revealed itself again to be precarious and fragile, never properly extending itself to them or their territory, enunciating in those moments a colonial past that refused to stay there, historically there in a before state. Suddenly, as I'm sure many of you remember, the largest deployment of troops in the history of indigenous settler relations in North America were deployed to Gunnesadage, as this was the most unambiguous form of exceptional relations. This was war. There were 2,650 soldiers deployed to handle 55 people, most of whom were women and children. I want to think now about what the law failed to contain in those moments, and we'll do so with a brief sociological descriptor that will attempt to contain what I just described. This was a 78-day armed standoff, one that resulted in 3 deaths. 3 arms of the law arrived: the Sûreté du Québec, the RCMP, and finally the 2,650 regular and reserve troops from the 34th and 35th Canadian Brigade groups and the 5th Canadian Mechanized Brigade group. They were brought in at the height of the tension when Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa requisitioned the assistance of the Canadian forces in a, quote, aid to the civil power by invoking the Emergencies Act. In that moment, the state of exception was official and colonial law was strangely, violently, and very precariously reinscribed. Simultaneously, the Canadian viewing public and negotiators were forced to listen to soundbites that issued from the Guyana de Goa. This brief sociological descriptor is a watershed moment so disorienting in this history of Indian-white relations in Canada that there was only one solution. Capital had to be released immediately to address, to redress, to assuage, to silence, some would say, once things came to a strange and immediate close. $5.2 million were released afterward by the federal government to buy the land in question for the federal government, finally to be purchased for the settler state, to then be held in trust for the Mohawks. And another $51.2 million was released for a 5-year royal commission to hold hearings around Canada on the issue of land and sovereignty and Indigenous rights. The Mohawks burned their weapons rather than buried them, peacefully surrendered, and were immediately incarcerated. This was a state of emergency that was not a state of exception for all. In this, the Salish scholar Luana Ross argues that the United States is genocide, and murder has never been illegal as such, and simultaneously murder has never been illegal. And in a similar vein, the legal scholar Sora Han argues the US is war and has always been war. I wondered then, as I wonder now, if Canada fancied itself in those moments to be the United States. In the political theorist Agamben's, he's exhausting, Giorgio Agamben, I quote him here just to make fun of him a little bit. In Agamben's exhaustive review of the labor of philosophical, juridical, and congressional law after law that works to conceal the suspension of individual and collective rights in times of emergency, forms of suspension that work to secure what he calls constitutional totalitarianism under the ruse of democracy, we see here a precise correspondence. This is a precise correspondence to this sociology of event I have just offered. However, this suspension of law is the norm, the geopolitical norm of indigeneity in constitutional democracies. The exception is the norm for us. The 78-day standoff at Oka resulted, as I said, in 3 deaths, a still improper configuration of territory, national outrage and shame, and that 5-year, $51.2 million Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples to investigate, to examine, and to textualize the problem. Numbering 5 volumes, and as you know, 4,000 pages. I'm sure there are people in the room who've read all of this and perhaps even participated in the process. This national exercise to document the problem created a multitude of recommendations, but none of those recommendations in this state-sponsored and state-driven research project needed to be heeded. Third, sympathy or shame. Now, just 2 years later, in 1992, Canada was first ranked #1 on the United Nations Human Development Index, hanging on to the top spot until 2001, when it dropped to 3rd, behind Norway and Sweden. It's like a hockey horror show, right? Hockey rankings. No, this is who's the best nation. The drop was attributed in part to Aboriginal poverty and diminished life expectancy, forms of suffering that registered upon agreed upon indices of national well-being. The affront to these indicators marked inequity in a manner that harmed the nation state in an international imaginary of the moral good, the healthy life, the robust nation, the caring nation. The statistical drop in ranking was also of a piece, or of the same time, I should say, with the foment that I started to describe with Oka. Just 3 months after Oka, there was another rupturing incident. This one televised via a nationally projected tell-all. This was the CTV characterization. the confession, the expose by the Manitoba Assembly of Chiefs, Phil Fontaine, of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse while a student at Fort Alexander Residential School in Manitoba. Fontaine's confession was more of a testimonial that would not, in its nationally televised form, specify the content of his abuse. Even after being asked twice by the late Barbara Frum about sexual abuse. He replied to her, "Some things are private," but did say that all the boys in his third grade class were abused, and possibly sexually. Fontaine's public interview created a national interest and furor in what became, in those very moments, the scandal of residential schools. Of course, many of you know this, and probably quite intimately, starting in Canada in the late 19th century and lasting until the late 1970s, residential schools were entrusted to various churches, but were eventually a state-driven mandate to civilize, whiten, and prepare Indian people for citizenship and private property. Now, what they were in practice was a carceral system of assimilatory violence. Thus, this scandal became knowable then through the currency of individual and then collective claims against the United Church of Canada, claims that have since bankrupted the church and resulted in the aforementioned 2007 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which was negotiated in response to more than 12,000 abuse cases and more than 70,000 former students of the, on behalf of more than 70,000 former students of the schools. The agreement set up a scale for harm and paid out 36,000 claimants and created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the behest of the claimants. This process of settlement, and I would say a very interesting form of adjudication, both on individual and collective levels, moved capital, moved money, moved sentiment, and moved possibility in different directions. But what I want to underscore in this emotional history of the almost present is how it stood in contradistinction and contradiction to the image of the masked warriors at Oka. The women who told those masked warriors at Oka what to do, who collectively and forcefully refused state encroachment. The impetus for that encroachment is what my colleague Elizabeth Pavanelli theorizes and tracks in her work as so-called liberal power. Liberal power distributes itself in accordance to a moral good, but one that is always economically at its base determined. It moves capital, it moves feelings, so that a market of profitability and concurrent emotion, in particular what she's interested in, and I'm interested in also sometimes, is shame, may collect for economic profitability, but also collect for national absolution along nodal points of pain, of redemption, of disbursement that will take the form of a minimal subsurface recognition. The recognition need not be deep. In the context of Australia, it is rendered through the impossibility of the recognition formula itself. It's one for that, in terms of their land claims, it's one that for many Indigenous claimants is unachievable, but it appears as if it is just. In this, the very existence perhaps of a formula and the possibility of meeting its requirements offers a chance at justice. And here access and reposition of traditional lands, not redress or compensation for their loss. Now, the events, these two events that I just detailed, I think operate as a logic, or instantiate a logic, I should say, a logic of dispossession and a structure of ongoing settlement. But this is also a structure and a story of accordant resistance or engagement that I don't want to assign to a spectacular space in studies of recognition or resistances. I think it wants to be known according to the market for rendering legibility and sympathy in this setting that I speak of now, Canada, which is a new space for settlement, an ongoing space of settlement. The requirements that Indian peoples be subject, that our subject status be known through the idiom of pain, was impossible in those first moments in 1990. As AK-47s do not speak of pain, they speak of the potential to unleash pain. The language of sovereignty demands to be spoken with and of now as Mohawks spoke of their land, of our governing system, of our political and theoretical framework for asserting that system against encroachment. Sovereignty then was made material, was embodied by the men and women who stood up in active defiance of the extension of a golf course into the bodies of our dead, of our ancestors, and in protection of the pine trees that similarly embodied to Haudenosaunee a mode of governance that instructs that we respect, honor, and protect land and water. All of this an impossibility within a normative order that struggles with its own shaky, precarious sovereignty. We know this from Quebec's fitful partnership within Confederation and sought to align itself with its own precarious beginnings, its own really horrible origin story of force, perhaps a lot of deceit, and the suspension of law. Finally, failed commensuration. How then to commensurate, how to balance these geopolitical and biopolitical imperatives with pain, with a sudden concern and apparent shock over the scandal of residential schools? How to commensurate then with the pain of abuse, of rape, of institutionalized pedophilia? I did not make that word up. I borrow the term institutionalized pedophilia from the written decision of Supreme Court Justice Douglas Hogarth on his 1995 sentencing of the especially egregious and possibly still living, in spite of my daily affirmations of his speedy death, Alberni residential school pedophile Arthur Plint. Every morning I wake up and I say, go to bed and don't wake up. Plint sexually abused 30 Native boys at the Port Alberni Residential School in British Columbia while he was dormitory supervisor there from 1948 to 1968. And the responsibility for his abuse, the legal and fiscal responsibility for what he did, was absorbed curiously by the state, or not curiously. The case against Plint with 21 litigants was the first of its kind to disperse fiduciary responsibility from the individual, the monstrous Arthur Plint, to the church, 25% paid by the church, and to the federal government, 75% paid by them. The original $30 million claim against him actually amounted to much less, and it set up a scale for harm in the following way. A high of Canadian $145,000 paid to a former student who had been subjected to anal and oral rapes that were extremely violent and brutal and were accompanied by threats. To a low of Canadian $10,000 for a student involved in, quote, 2 instances where Plint took his hand and placed it on Plint's genital area while both were fully clothed. There were additional similar assaults by Plint. This litigant had not, and I quote, not proved that any of the psychological difficulties he had experienced in his life after leaving the school were likely caused by the incidents he described. The other awards were for $125,000, $85,000, $20,000, and $15,000, bringing the total to Canadian $400,000. Recall that the original claim against him was $30 million. Now, how to commensurate the pain and agony and continued suffering of those whose lives, whose bodies, whose young bodies were considered of so little worth that they were subject to state and church sanctioned intrusion, to a constant of violation. And this violation occurred under the sign of civilization and white beneficence. The argument of repair and the earlier discussion of injury is critical here. How do we commensurate there, this is how I want to change the question, diminish bodily sovereignty? How do we restore it within a market for adjudication? How can their new subjecthood, a status as survivors at best, but largely strangulated Indigenous nationals and simultaneous subjects of state violation, that's where this discourse of survivor comes from, and violence, be made legible enough then for adjudication? Is it to be found within the market of sympathy and narration, in the transnational model of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that set up shop in Canada in 2008 and states quite simply, the truth of our common experiences will help set our spirits free and pave the way for reconciliation. Here I quote the mandate of the commission as retold to the CBC. The purpose of the commission is not to determine guilt or innocence, but to create a historical account of the residential schools, to help people to heal and encourage reconciliation between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginal Canadians. The commission will also, as we all know, it did host events across the country to raise awareness about the residential school system and its impact. As well, the TRC has a budget of $60 million. It was formally established on June 1st, 2008, and here its official word is, will complete its work within 5 years. And here, the commission, to remind us, to resurrect the earlier part of this piece on the contract. The commission is also predicated upon a kind of contract or contractual thinking, a time-sensitive model of disbursement. And in this, a form of liberal power theorized by Pavanelli. Here it is a power that in this place opens bodies up, souls up perhaps for inspection, expects and invites narratives that notably are not legally binding, so perpetrators are excised from the archive, protecting them from further legal action, and creates yet another, like RCAP, settler archive of what has happened. Now I ask, who has been inspected and for whom and to what effect? Here, one of my interlocutors for this book project, Savage States, argued on the conciliatory nature of reconciliation. It's not. It's called reconciliation because it's what they need to call it. It serves them. There's nothing that Canada does in any way that serves us. Everything Canada has done over the last 4.5 centuries of presence here is aimed at genocide. That's what you've got to know. You've got to be absolutely clear. Economic genocide, political genocide, femicide, infanticide, that's what the removal of children is. It's genocide. It's a part of the Genocide Convention, and it's to prevent anyone from suing under that, she's saying, of TRC. That's what reconciliation is all about, to just stop it. Because if we figure it out and get some schmaltz about it, I was going to say balls. But anyway, that's my rant. That is the subject of the new work on what colonialism really is. She was basically schooling me big time, telling me what to do, which I appreciated. I'm now doing it. Glenn Couthard has characterized this focus exclusively on the survivors with TRC as rendering, quote, Indigenous subjects as the primary object of repair, not the colonial relationship. I'm struggling with this now. How to think about this. What is going on and what work is this doing? The disbursement here is, yes, of funds of a sort, but funds that are to be palliative and through the prefigured indices of sympathy. A sympathy that performs the semblance of a listening state, a caring state, a Humesian state that imagines your pain. The then conservative prime minister said in 2008, "I'm sorry. Speaking as a state that I hurt you," he didn't actually say this, but that I hurt you, that I took you from your parents, that I raped you. Will the testimonial and therapeutic model, the voyeuristic model of governance, restore a body to its former state? Will it remove the scars and wounds and ongoing suffering that mark Indigenous bodies and communities today? More crucially, perhaps, or at least as significantly, will land be given back? And can bodies be given back? Can they be restored to their former state? Is that something that actually can be reconciled? A stolen body, a stolen youth, the theft of land. Here, one of the other interlocutors for my book argued, and it is worth quoting at length, I guess maybe the one thing that's different is that they're asking us for forgiveness this time. They're asking us to forgive them for what they've done. And that's where they're playing on this emotional turmoil in our communities, because they understand that therapeutic approaches demand that you forgive your abuser, supposedly in order to transcend your pain and reach a place of peace and well-being. So this whole framework that is well developed in Native communities through therapeutic practitioners and models and so forth, choices, social work theory, all of this stuff where you have to let go of your anger, forgive people, and then be free. To me, that's complete bullshit. But it's definitely the hegemonic mentality in regard to what's happening to us and the colonial heritage that we have. And I'll tell you something, I don't buy it, but most people do. And you know, so you're in an environment where if you carry on as if you're upset about the fact that your land was stolen and that you begrudge white people for that theft or white society for doing that and benefiting from it, then you're the one with the problem because you failed to overcome your anger and you're failing to forgive. So this is just completely being embedded in every institution in Canada these days, this approach, and promoted in the media, in the arts. And so that's what I think reconciliation is. It's just Canadians' demand for forgiveness while not changing in any way what they're actually doing. Look at the court decision that came out last month, the Chikotlim one, framed in terms of a necessary step to reconciliation. Well, what is the necessary step? Acknowledging that natives were here first, but still reserving the right to dispossess them if the stakes are high enough and demanding that they acknowledge, in fact, that they are not nations? This new law, this new court decision law, elaboration of Aboriginal title law, basically told natives that they're not nations. You're citizens of Canada. You have rights by virtue of the fact that you've been here for quite a while, but that could be anybody, whether you're native or not. Provincial laws apply. You have no special powers, and if we want to take away this Aboriginal title that you have, we'll take it away. That's what this Chikotlim decision says explicitly, and says that it's reconciliation. So what is reconciliation? Colonization, with a face that is seemingly sensitive, seemingly respectful, but in fact no different than any other era. To me, that's what it is. And I think a lot of people are starting to see it for what it's worth. Now, I too don't know if the therapeutic model is really a way out of this all. And this ongoing theft through vigorous extraction, the murdered and missing women, the men who are over-incarcerated, the matter of this place, these places, the ongoing living and dead detritus of a violent political project that now asks for forgiveness, that expects it, that pathologizes those among us that are critical. And this forgiveness is for one thing and one thing only. This therapeutic move seems for now to be the only game in town. A game that the critical race studies scholar and theorist Denise De Silva might call the tyranny of the fetish of the transparent self, the modern subject, the imagined modern subject. One that works to be like the imagined authorizing center, be it in this case the imagined white man, the civilized self, the dispossessing rather than the dispossessed, and the project of according to that ideal, to repair the wound of the difference between us. So that these differences, whether they be raced, indigenous, queered, you take your pick, able-bodied, not able-bodied, will not stand outside the normative and territorial center of the moral, universal, and modal subject, the absent but apparent white man. Restoration, repair, reconciliation. I am sorry, in brackets, that I raped you. This is the gestural architecture of settler states that repair only to allow a joining, a concurrence, and a so-called equality, and assimilation, and I would say a further swallowing. I'm arguing in other parts of this book for an extraction, the stories of suffering and extraction, the oil, a simultaneous extraction from us. But for some, a truly contrite state would be really great. It'd be really ideal, and is for them really great and really ideal, and I respect that. We said we are sorry, now we can reconcile. But what if some things are simply not reconcilable? Because for some, and perhaps actually for many, who form these differently subjected bodies and philosophical orders, life within this form of subject position has been, in fact, a living death, and a fight for life, a fight even for the bodies of the dead, as we saw in 1990, and the land that nourishes those bodies to have integrity, a concordant respect by the living. Now, what we have in this series of events that I've just unpacked for you, I think is a mapping out of that impossibility and a move, I hope, away from eventfulness, like, oh, these epiphenomenal, like, oh, this event that just happened that has no context and no connection to other events, a move away from eventfulness and into structure, logic, a making clear of things that may not have been linked in your minds. If we are to be voyeurs, let us look upon those linkages, not the auditory narratives and visual narratives of hell, of wounded adult children who were vulnerabilized again, as 3 people said to me during the TRC hearings, into pornographic, surreal spectacles of suffering. While people, I heard in the Victoria hearings, ate popcorn and hot dogs and cried with them. How one can somehow eat while that is going on is beyond me, but especially popcorn and hot dogs. When power takes a certain form and demand and requires that we line up in certain ways and presents then an impossibility of concordance, I want to argue that it then requires a volley of spectacles. The handsome prime minister in his headdress, etc. And in this, the apologies, the spectacles of contrition. And in this, the inducement avatar, I've written about avatar also, the inducement to move public sentiment forward right now, immediately. Right now, or right now as it should have been back then. This is the repair. Indigenous bodies were torn open way before Oka, right? As with our land, way before. But Oka and its quiet and then militarized reminders required a spectacular repair to territorial and historical injuries of the settlers' sovereignty, of the Indians' young bodies, and fast. That second injury, the one that seems to haunt us all, made itself known in part through Phil Fontaine's initial refusal to specify the content of his wound. However, the new TRC, an official listening exercise that archived these narratives of deep suffering and pain, took into its auditory arena all of these, presumably, all of these wounds. Oka, and that is also false, Oka, of course, will never be forgotten in this territorial context, along with the other pushbacks. However, that specific land remains improperly rendered, and Indigenous bodies remain themselves, and simultaneously outside of themselves in this new market for their pain. And in this, the exteriority of their lives from the West, from the points of reason, from the absent, invisible, but universal idea of the white man, I would say, the normative center that is unmarked, opens up a further space for settler instantiation. And now I want to say, with the language of reconciliation, a settler absolution and a restoration of their innocence. Thank you.
Hey everybody, so we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Sure.
So anybody that wants to ask a question?
Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. I accept your arguments and I applaud it.
Oh, good. Surprised.
I'm looking for a logic of repair and reparation that we can derive from this in the here and now and act upon that. In this province, we're about to have a provincial election. The provincial government has aligned itself with extraction and affect in exactly the way that you articulated them. Do you have any advice for us about how we interrupt and displace that discourse in the interest of perhaps a more just outcome?
So I love your question. I don't know enough about what's going on in Saskatchewan, but one thing I'm finding really helpful for myself, my therapy, I critique therapy all the time, but my political process is to say, you're not going to tell me how to feel, right? So this is one, I think we're being constantly conscripted and told how to feel, right? And this is part of this manipulative move by governments to appeal to us in a kind of moral but also sensing self. And I would just say, like, check in yourself. You're not going to tell me how to feel. This isn't right. You should not be raping the land. No matter what, you're raping the land. That is not right. It's like raping women. It is not right, right? And I know this. So you just check in with yourself and say this. And I think that's something you can say publicly. This is wrong. And you're not going to tell me that this is how I should feel about it. I feel and I know this is wrong to do this. So that would be one thing I would say, to disrupt and this constant conscription to feel a certain way politically about bad behavior, ongoing bad behavior, right? Does that help? Just say no. Hey, Caroline, my old friend from grad school.
That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and I said a little depressed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But what I want to ask you just is, so you went back to MOCA.
Yeah.
Why not to the constitutional talks?
Somebody asked
that,
us.
because I think particularly of Jim Sinclair and and some of his words, and just I think in the wonderful documentary, right? So dancing around the table, and you see very clearly the relationships that were, and at that point in time, the idea of suffering or injury was skirted quite differently, and actually not in that language whatsoever. But what I always love when I go back to the documentary is how prepared our Indigenous leaders were, and just how dismissed they were in that context.
That's a great comment, and I will take it. It's a history of emotions and ideas that definitely probably could go deeper than 1990. 1990, to me, of course, is a kind of baseline for things because these are my people, but that doesn't mean it is the baseline for everybody. But it also represents such a sharp shift in what happened in terms of where I'm starting the story. But I think the story, of course, can go back, definitely, to Meech Lake Accord also. I mean, that was such a refusal, right, by Harper. So, thank you. Yes?
I just want to say thank you for your words. I think you validated my argument because last year I did a paper on the criminalization of Indigenous women, and part of my argument was the colonial racist attitudes within the criminal justice system is, it's directed towards Indigenous people, and with everything that you said, it just kind of validated. So, thank you.
I'm glad to be useful. Thank you. I have another piece that I'm working through, and Heidi Stark, who's an Anishinaabe political scientist at UVic, is working through. She's helping me so much to think this. She has a piece called Criminal Empire, and she's looking at how, through time, Indigenous political protest and the ways in which we've interpreted treaty has produced us as criminals through time. And I think this is incredibly useful for thinking about the ways in which our criminality is produced today. So these are matters of interpretation, but also I think matters of day-to-day politics that carry this logic of history with us, right? And so she looks at the hangings of men on the American side, up in Chicotlan territory. It's just an incredibly useful piece, and I'm hoping that we're going to see this in press very soon. It's under review, but I've used it for new work that I'm doing on refusal, where I have this concept, it's not only mine or whatever, but this notion of refusal that I work on in my book, and I really, and so I use her work for that, but also I think a key point that she's making is that the law and the state's criminalization of our people through time masks their criminality. And I think this is a profound intervention, right? It's something that you'll hear Indian people say, we didn't agree to this, this isn't how the treaty should be interpreted, they shouldn't be crossing this line. You'll hear this through time all the time, and that's why we'll go to war sometimes over this, right? But I mean, she's really making a broader claim and proving it, I think, through this examination of cases that they're masking their own criminality. And this is going to be useful, I think, for all of us, because we have to start pointing the finger also at this, the fiction of a state, the work of a state to make itself, which I'm trying to do that sometimes. It takes a lot of work. I know it gets a little excessive words to prove it, but I'm trying to argue the same thing as well. States are constructed, other people are doing this too. States are constructed, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of work to legitimate themselves continuously, and we are the perpetual reminder of their fundamental illegitimacy. So they always have problems with us, as long as we're alive. So, yes, Priscilla?
Tell us a story about how you dealt with the resistance of the academy.
Well, that's a different story. Shall we turn the cameras off? I have so many stories, but I don't want to tell them in public. But I'm having a really good go of things right now. So I have to, really literally in a place of other resistors. I'm at Columbia where everybody's hypercritical and alive to these issues, and it's embraced, and we're all kind of others there, right? So I don't have any problems where I roll. I have to say, when I was a graduate student, things were really hard. And Caroline Tate trained with me there. And I would say graduate school is always, anyway, so how did I deal with it? Let's just say, let's not recount the specificities. I got the hell out. I kept my eye on the prize, which was just getting out and finishing and carrying whatever burdens that obtain to our bodies in these places. Because sometimes, I don't think this is the case at U of S because you have all these cool faculty and, this is Indian territory and they can't deny it. Where I went to school, I went to McGill, which is basically a Scottish Presbyterian stronghold. That's a joke, but it's not. I think there was a sense that, I think there were certain ideas about my capabilities. So I just did it the best I could, which was sometimes better than them. So I was in that other hardworking, overworking, and very depressed mode of graduate school. And I think there are other minoritized people or Indians or people of color or whatever that have carried those burdens of expectation as well and had to overcompensate because of it. But it means nobody can come at me with anything because I'm ready. I'm used to dealing with the white men. So we'll erase that from the tape. Even though I'm tenured. Anything else? You can go have a 7-Up and chill out. I know it's a depressing piece. So you're all sad, but critical activity is good, so that's energizing. So it's like a good workout, right? Yes?
So I have some thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, I want to thank you for some of the cognitive dissonance I'm experiencing. And I want to pick up on what this gentleman was talking about in a political kind of way, a climate that we find ourselves in around the urgency of trying to impact the discourse during a political election.
Yes.
Which really isn't about democracy or anything else for that matter. But I'd like to ask you to help me unpack the concept of performative sovereignty within the current milieu we find ourselves in. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the subterranean arguments of this piece is that, and it picks up in some ways from my buddy Glenn's book and also my own thinking independent of Glenn, who never cites me. Not that I'm mad, but I'm just noting that again. The 5 women he cites, I'm not one of them. Even though we're on the same track. But Glenn's good argument, one of them, is that you can't be outright violent anymore. So the violence is quieter, the force is quieter. And it's not just Glenn, there are other folks, Foucault, et cetera, building from Foucault. So I think there's still a form of violence, and I'm trying to say that here also, but it's the violence of passions, it's the violence of, I don't say love, but it's feeling and identifying and imagining what you are for others. And then, and recognizing perhaps that there was wrongdoing, was past tense, and then performing a kind of contrition or a kind of emotion that will repair. And that emotion can't be anger. Anger is not allowed anymore from anyone, right? So spectacles, I think, and here I don't say it, but I'm pulling from that French post-structuralist Guy Debord. Spectacles help to govern, right? Spectacles are like the big thing that takes up all of your visual energy and doesn't tell you how it's produced. It's a perfect sort of object or product or commodity. There are people that are themselves like spectacles. And this is where Obama, when they go after his biography and they're like, oh, but he was born in Hawaii. Oh, but his mom is white. Oh, but. You know, they need him to be a certain way, and that's to be a black man. But he's a complicated black man. And Trudeau is the handsome, perfect white man, right? He's a spectacle of sorts also. And that's why him with the headdress on was like, whoa, right? For some of us. For others of us, they were like, yeah, man, he's wearing a headdress. He's got an Indian name. So these spectacles also help to move sentiment, I think, in ways that can be quite forceful. But the key with spectacles, I think, is that they themselves don't show you how they are produced. So we don't ask after, and I try to do this in the beginning of this paper, why are these things significant? Because they demand that we not ask after why they're significant. Why is this so electorally significant, right? Why is Trudeau so significant? I mean, I have a hard time getting away from his lineage, and yet I think that's the thing that people also are like about him. But he's operating as this spectacle of benevolent, I think, fresh-faced whiteness that's going to lead us out of something. But even his own biography, I think, suggests something pretty scary for us. Like his dad was the architect of the white paper. So that's where I see spectacles and sentiment doing this kind of work. It's like the work of force that can't happen anymore because this is supposedly a democratic state that doesn't use violence to govern. I'm saying it uses affect, it uses performance, it uses good feelings, and it expects you to have those feelings. And if you don't have those feelings, then you're bad news. And let me tell you, I don't have those feelings. Like I do not have I'm one of those people that gets pissed, right? But you're not supposed to get pissed. You're supposed to like feel better about what is happening in front of you. So I refuse that. Yes?
I've just finished teaching Speaking My Truth, which comes from the Edward Humphrey Foundation. Put together. It's a compilation of survivors' stories along with the apologies. Your talk is made me think about why, I can tell you why I did it, but the problem that your talk poses for me. Why I did it, I'm teaching a 300 level class, undergraduates, relatively young. Many of them who know about the residential schools, but actually don't have a lot of knowledge about what actually happens. And one of my kind of approaches in class to connect the head to the heart. In a way, I feel that what you're saying is that perhaps that's not the way to go. And I'm just wondering if you'd comment.
Sure. So first of all, you're like to be commended for teaching that material, which is so hard, right? So I commend you for that. And what I would say is, I am not prescriptive in that I want to tell anybody what to do, right? At all. How to think, what to think. I might suggest how to think, right? So I would think critically about it. And my suggestion, not that you should listen to me at all, is that continue teaching it, but with an electrified sense for the students of its critical import within a larger frame of dispossession. So, they were dispossessing us of our prior sovereignties, nationhood, family relations in those spaces. That is an archive of that process. And that's how one might teach it. Not as the wounded subjects that now cannot function in their communities, which would be the more dangerous, I'd say, way of teaching it in terms of the effects. But I would say teach it just with an electrified sense of what it can do, right? Analytically and politically. It is an archive also of another kind of dispossession. My beef with the TRC is it privileges only one form of the dispossession, right? It's this one horrible, dispossessing us of our youth, of our families, et cetera. They also dispossess us of our land, right? of our normative gender orders, of our senses of ourselves and all of this. And that's what so much of our struggle is today, along with outright sovereignty, or what we might want to think of as sovereignty, approximate to sovereignty. So that's what I would say about it, right? It's like with Royal Commission, like they kind of flip me out on one hand with these archives, like archive, but that's useful material. Archives are useful, you go back to them, right? And then you can do different things with them. And those folks were brave and they stood up and they told these stories, and I don't condemn them.
Right? I think one of the things that I focused on, it's very easy to get caught up in the woundedness of people, but also to talk about resiliency, that they're here, that they have written these stories. Some of them are not necessarily scholars. We have to have people help them, and that we're here to tell their story.
Right.
And also the contradictions and tensions of people. It's not a one size fits all.
Right. Yeah. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your talk, and I look forward to the panel tonight as well. My question is really comments on, I think you said settler colonialism is totalitarian by nature, like seeks to totally control everything within the nation state. And you mentioned Flipart as well, who makes the argument that settler colonialism is wedded to capitalism inherently, and he makes the argument very briefly that the hegemony, the dominance of primitive accumulation, the forever seeking of new markets of capitalism, basically takes away any sort of, and how the politics of liberal recognition masks that, takes away any sort of chance for, I guess, decolonization within the framework that we have. So do you see reconciliation as being at all possible within the context of capitalism, or does capitalism need to?
I think it's essential to capitalism. I think it's a technique of capitalism. It keeps things going. And these reconciliatory spectacles, one I'm desperate to talk about, the Wab Canoe incident. Right? To me, he's a perfect neoliberal subject, and he's performing this aggressive capital accumulation within himself as he remakes himself to meet the market for sympathy and votes. So I mean, this is a perfect embodiment of that process. And it's within the frame of reconciliation or conciliation that you see these performances of being sorry and then starting over anew. So I think it's part of, it holds hands with capitalism. It holds hands with the recognition process. They're all in it together. And there are embodiments of that and spectacles of it that I think, in time with that question about affect, that are doing this kind of work for us. And producing a sense of what is virtuous and what is actually, and helping to define political behavior and what is possible. So, so I think reconciliation is not, to me, there's nothing radical or innovating about it, except perhaps it's opening up a space to cry, to weep and to feel grief, which for some is very cathartic, and that's that therapeutic move, right? And I get that very much. I understand it. And I don't know if I would define that really, though, as transformative. I would say it helps you to get through something that is very hard. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question. I mean, but it helps me to clarify my existing critique of it, of reconciliation. Are we done?
We're just starting.
We have until tonight, don't we? I want to 7-Up. Yes? Yes? You can do one more. You can do one more? Thank you.
But I wanted to ask if reconciliation is not the solution.
Oh, God. Why didn't we end this? It's a great question. Well, I don't know for sure. Part of me wants to say a revolution, but I don't know what it'll look like. I haven't thought that through. I'd say an ongoing active attention to what is before us and a continuing care and vigilance over each other. But an active, like I keep talking about my buddy Glenn, because he does have this like resurgence paradigm, land-based pedagogies, get back on our land and, do this kind of work on the land, live our lives differently in a contentious relationship. Gerald Alford would say contentious relationship with capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. I get that, and I think those are important models also, but I would say just in our day-to-day lives to have a very critically engaged sense of things that are before us, and to question what is before us and do it elegantly and diplomatically and with, I'm not going to say love, because I think this love thing is getting abused a bit, but to do this with a kind of care for each other, because we care for each other, right? So, and I think critique can be a form of deep care and sovereignty, and also there is the possibility, which sometimes is seen as very inelegant and not diplomatic, of simply refusing things. So like some things I don't accept, like refusals, I don't accept that apology, several recent ones. That's it, I think it's just too much to ask sometimes. I'm not a stupid person, don't insult me, not you, but in general, like don't insult me. That was horrible behavior and I am not going to accept that. And that's it. So I think we can all try that a little bit sometimes, right? No reason, know why we do that, and just like, you know what, this is some BS. I'm walking away. That's a possibility. And then you create your own spheres of critical engagement and care and attention and activity. And I know it sounds a little theoretical, but there's also going out on the land and hunting and doing that good work also. Myself, I'm on the wagon. I usually like to say I'm a martini revolutionary. So right now I'm a 7-Up revolutionary. That's my form of terrible. It sounds terrible. So let me shut up.
Yeah. So as Audra said, there's another event tonight, 7 o'clock, Station 20 West. There's going to be 3 speakers, so kind of 3 times the fun here. Also, if you're interested, we kind of got a little bit of a snippet here of a lot of Audra's work, but her work, as well as Kim Anderson and Kim Tallbear, is for sale outside. So if you wanted to kind of read more on this, I would encourage you. I've read a good chunk of them. They're all great books, so please check that out. But before we go, could you all please join me in giving a big hand to Audra Simpson?